be given this principle to discuss. It feels like the complementary nature of services are really important and really reflective of the principle of community power that we at New Local have been articulating and trying to understand in the context of, as Nick mentioned, our work on the community paradigm. For us, the concept of community power reflects this principle of complementary nature of services. It covers a wide range of approaches, initiatives and activity, from deliberative democracy from asset-based service delivery approaches to wider peer support networks and different community-led grassroots initiatives. But what those activities have in common, the community power approach as we see it, is that they have a firm belief in an understanding that communities themselves, individuals themselves, have the knowledge and skills and assets themselves that makes them best placed to identify and respond to the challenges that they face. But I want to use my time now to just talk about how in many ways the system of public service provision as we see it and as we experience it isn't set up to sufficiently leverage people's capacity to have insight into their own situation. I think wanting to pick up a little bit on the point Eddie was making in his opening remarks about where the power in the system lies. So if we reflect on this principle, the opposite of it is that power lies much more within institutions and public service bodies than it does, and largely the centralised nature of our country, but power largely rests in institutions as opposed to people and places. We have articulated two public service paradigms, the state and the market paradigm, which are two overbearing features of how our public services are incentivized to behave and how they behave at the moment, which characterizes a lot of the public service provision that we get. So the state paradigm would have come into force from the late 1940s to the 1980s. It's the dominant paradigm that continues to frame the architecture of public service provision to this day. Features of the state paradigm include that there's a default assumption within services that there's institutional and professional dominance. Services are accountable to Whitehall departments, not to people and places, and there's an assumption that officials and experts know best. So under this paradigm, there is the person and the community is deemed a passive recipient of what a predetermined service offer. The market paradigm kind of grew out of that. It didn't fundamentally alter the substantive architecture of the state paradigm, which does still exist, a kind of Whitehall-led model. But the market paradigm came to force in the 1980s and is having dwindling efficacy to this day. But it does remain a dominant force, which tried to inject a bit of choice and control into the service provision, driving cost efficiencies and trying to create more effective services. But actually what's happened is that you're still largely a passive recipient of a predetermined service offer. You might have a bit more choice and control, there might be a bit more competition between providers, but you're not shaping what provisions on offer. And actually what's happened is much more of a transactional relationship. So in marketising public services, there's a need to break down activity and interactions into kind of costed units of interaction. So there's much more of a transactional relationship. So the individual is not so much a passive recipient as more of a customer or client, but there's still a kind of transactional model there. And under both the state and the market paradigms, you're incredibly limited in terms of how much control you have and how much you would be able to shape what's available, and clearly leverage your own insights into your own situation. And I think what I'd like to just say is that both of these paradigms have dwindling efficacy. There is a real urgency that faces our public services, but there's one great opportunity that we find ourselves in the moment as we're sort of on the cusp of the early 2020s. There is an enormous demand challenge on public services. it's not sustainable for public services it's not sustainable for us to outsource our problems for public services to resolve and parcel back to us. So actually what public services need to be able to do is exactly this principle, is be much more capable of leveraging people's insights into their own situation, because it's not desirable or sustainable for the state to always do it, or services to do it on our behalves, and it's not going to be sustainable into the future. We know about demand pressures on NHS acute services, and this kind of hierarchical approach isn't sustainable for the longer term, and a market paradigm approach also has diminishing returns. When you need to take on a much more collaborative approach, it's quite hard in that transactional environment. So as a consequence, public services are going to be trapped ever more into a situation where they're going to be delivering kind of symptomatic responses to deeper issues, and there's a risk that we have a system that is going to be much more focused on acute crisis provision than long-term preventative practice. But there's a big opportunity, which I think we need to kind of understand, leverage a little bit more, which is that there's an enormous clamour amongst people for more control over their lives, and a massive expectation that they will have more control over their lives. There's a big sense of their own efficacy. We see this in a kind of negative sense with populism and the take back control kind of mantra that seemed to chime with people. We use social media to kind of as platforms, and we're not used to being passive recipients in many spheres of our lives. So why should it be the same in public service provision? And I think the mutual aid response to the early days of the pandemic really showed how much of a desire, and kind of tapping into what Clinton was saying about contribution, how much of a desire people have to contribute, and how much of a desire that is a kind of latent force that really isn't leveraged systematically by our public services. And so I think it's possible to say that probably in the early days of the pandemic, when we were really seeing this kind of neighbour-to-neighbour support network and communities mobilising incredibly quickly, communities were acting in a matter of days, where you would maybe see councils responding in a matter of weeks, and government in a matter of months. And so unless I would argue, unless our wider system of public services is much more capable of leveraging in non-crisis times that latent desire for people to have more control over what's on offer, I think that there is a very real risk that public services aren't viable in the future. And to an extent, the last 10 years of the kind of macro political debate about austerity, it's kind of become a kind of invest or cut discussion, and actually some of the really rich pioneering stuff that's been going on much more under the radar of national policymakers just isn't kind of coming to the fore in terms of how we're thinking about public service reform more generally and into the next decade. So I think we've got the challenge of rising demand and the opportunity for people to want to take more control over their lives, and those are really the driving factors behind why we would potentially try to see a shift towards a more of a community paradigm as opposed to state and market paradigm. And there's a fundamental principle underpinning this, which is that people are much more actively involved in the design and delivery of public services. So I think we need to think about how at the moment the system logic is very much against, it militates against a lot of the work around local area coordination. And so I guess the kind of question I want to leave with participants to kind of focus on is how do we kind of transform the system from outside? There's all this amazing work that goes on, but it is often against the kind of state and market paradigm assumptions. So that basically has lots of implications for how practitioners operate, how the state operates, how public services are funded, how they're incentivised, how accountability runs through the system, not vertical silos to Whitehall, but kind of horizontally to place, and how services collaborate in different ways. And I think at the heart of all of that is this principle of how you are putting the person at the centre, and the centre of gravity comes outside the institutions and to people and places incredibly strongly. It's an area that there are no easy answers for, but it's certainly an area that New Local is going to be continuing to focus on in the future. So thanks very much. I'll leave it there.